Well, hello there. Welcome back to Intermediate Writing or Composition. Professor Kent Lee here. Today, in this lecture, we're going to look at some analysis paragraphs or essays, and there's some samples in my book. The first one is called How a Poem Functions Psychologically, a one-paragraph writing sample on page 88 in the book. And the next one is actually kind of a business case study about Yahoo, the famous tech company. If you don't know who they are, I'll tell you about them later. Well, let's look at the first one, how a poem functions psychologically. I asked you to analyze one of these two examples, I think for a Google form assignment, and I'll kind of give you just my feedback. I'm not going to touch on everything. You may have pointed out some other interesting issues and problems with these examples. This looks at The Raven, one of my favorite poems actually, as an example of how a poem functions psychologically. It sounds like a really nice topic. It's a suitable topic probably for a college paper and a course in literature and poetry at the college level. Probably if you're doing a master's or PhD, you'd get far more technical than this. For a college paper, this is not a bad start, but let me talk about some problems with it. Each point is kind of explained very superficially. Even the main idea, the thesis, that a good poem engages readers on a psychological level, well, that might be okay for a thesis, or you could be a little more specific or precise. But then the rest of the paragraph, this is a long paragraph, the various points are just discussed very, very briefly. There's one point about, the meter and the rhyme. Okay, fine. But that's only discussed for a couple of sentences, a few sentences. There's mood and key words, the darkness, okay, content words, and that's discussed for a few sentences. Okay, rhymed mood words that are rhymed. Okay, that's discussed very briefly. Each idea is discussed very briefly, and each idea is not very clearly defined. What are the main ideas? It would be better to kind of break this up into multiple paragraphs. Okay, psychologically how? Okay, the meter, the rhyme scheme, the use of rhyming with the key moody words, and symbolism. Okay, symbolism. Each of these could be at least a separate paragraph. So the discussion is very superficial. A point is kind of brought up and it's discussed for a couple of sentences, then it moves on to another point. It's a very brief, superficial development. There's no satisfying development of ideas in any depth or detail. So you'd want to identify a number of key points, specific aspects you would talk about. Meter, rhyming of mood words, symbolism, linguistic symbolism, and each of these could be discussed in much more depth. There could be comparison with other examples from the same poet or other examples from the same genre or similar poems to make these points. So more examples could be brought in. More detailed explanation based on literary theory. If you're taking a class, you are in literature, you may not realize it, but you're learning elements of literary theory, and you're being asked to then apply them to analyzing some literature. Well, a more detailed analysis here involving the literary theory, aspects of literary theory, what literary theory says about poetry, and how it affects the reader. And then more detailed explanation of the psychology. There needs to be more detailed explanation of how these things work psychologically. Some psychological explanation. So the explanation here is kind of superficial. It looks like something I could have written in an afternoon, in an hour without really thinking about it and without really consulting any sources. So there need to be some source citations in here, citing, of course, maybe other poems, citing literary scholars, perhaps, and their views on the poem and interpretation of this poem, Some citations about the psychological aspects of how literature affects us psychologically, perhaps. So there need to be sources here. There are no sources. That makes it very weak for, I think, what the writer is trying to do is an original analysis. The writer is trying to present this as his or her own kind of unique idea, analysis, insights. Well, in order to develop your ideas better and inform the better development of ideas, you need to look at some sources and look what others have written about similar ideas or different ideas that you want to pull together into your own creative new ideas. That needs to be done here. So this would need to be broken up into multiple paragraphs, developed as multiple paragraphs. Next, let's look at the Yahoo case study. I don't know if you know Yahoo. Some of you may be too young to know this. Before Google, there was Yahoo and some other search sites. And at first, Yahoo was one of the first ones, and it wasn't really a search engine at first. It was more of an internet portal. It would be like a portal, like a gateway. I don't know where I want to go on the internet. I don't know where to find something. So you go to something like Yahoo. And instead of typing in search terms, they had these categories. It was like a classification of different categories: entertainment, science, technology, business, personal stuff, and people. And you go to one of those and click it on each, and had a bunch of subcategories and subcategories. And these had to be maintained by Yahoo employees who had to manually put together this kind of portal. And you finally get to one of these subcategories, and you see all the links that are relevant, the web pages that you might want to find. It was a very kind of awkward or clunky way of organizing things, and it worked in the early days of the internet, but as the internet grew, it quickly became a useless way of looking for information. And so Yahoo then transitioned to more of a search engine setup, something sort of like Google. They created their own search engine. But also they tried to diversify or expand into lots of other things. Okay, they created an email service. Okay, that was good, actually, and it was very popular. People still use it. But then they try to offer all kinds of other internet services and information services and shopping services and news services and all kinds of stuff. And they just it was a diversification that went out of control. It ran amok, as we say. It ran out of control. So in the book here, I have what is essentially sort of a business case study. It's on page 89, how Yahoo destroyed its value. You don't hear about Yahoo anymore because, they kind of tanked. They kind of, went under. I mean, they still exist as a company, but not doing too well. A much smaller company now than it used to be. So let's look at this case study. This is from a business news website, a business site or something. It's more of an informal or semi-formal case study. For one thing, there are no source citations, and in the business world, when they do case studies in like business news magazines, they may not cite sources. But in my class, I want you to actually cite sources in order to do a better, proper case study, a more formal case study. This is more of an informal case study. There are no citations here, no sources cited. It's kind of maybe general information to people in the news media, but some details should be cited here. I think that's a problem. Anyway, as a case study, it starts out, it doesn't give much background about the company because probably a lot of people reading this are familiar with Yahoo. I was, in the 1990s, pretty much everyone used Yahoo for a while into the early 2000s. Everybody used it, and we were all familiar with it. So there is a little bit more background so there's the introductory paragraph, gives a little bit of background to the company, and then the problem. The kind of the research question or the problem is posed. So there's actually a very good thesis statement at the end of the first paragraph. There are three major reasons for Yahoo's failure, and here it's specifically focusing on M&A, merger and acquisition. So when one company buys another company and they try to incorporate this smaller company into itself, so a merger or acquisition. So Yahoo tried to rely a lot on mergers and acquisitions, taking over other companies and sometimes incorporating those companies and their employees into itself. So the thesis here is there are three major reasons for the M&A failure: the strategy, the valuation, and integration. So valuation, how the company is valued, like its stock prices, how the company values itself in the way it maybe pursues acquisitions or thinks about an offer from a company that wants to buy it, as we'll see here. And then integration, like when you buy another company, you integrate that company and its employees into your own company, integration. That's a good thesis statement and kind of a follow-up sentence that Yahoo is a classic case study in how mishandling these can destroy a company's value. And indeed, Yahoo did destroy its value because it barely exists. It exists, but it's nothing compared to what it used to be. So again, the next paragraph, the next two body paragraphs are a little bit of background about the idea of mergers and acquisitions. So not so much background about Yahoo itself, but about the process of mergers and acquisitions. So in formal writing, even in academic writing too, you've probably learned you have an introductory paragraph, then you have your body paragraphs. Each body paragraph presents kind of a main argument or main point that relates to the main thesis, the main idea of the whole essay. However, we can kind of elaborate on that because there's more to that that's often done in academic writing and in writing like this. You don't just have regular body paragraphs that kind of present and develop, main points, the thesis, but in between you might have a background paragraph. So you can have the introduction, which kind of sets up the issue and the thesis, and you might have background in the intro paragraph, or you can have a separate paragraph, or in this case, two paragraphs, before you get into the actual content of the body paragraph. So there are two background paragraphs here. It kind of talks about how strategies and mergers and acquisitions generally work, and it gives kind of another famous example from the tech industry of a successful strategy, successful acquisition in the third paragraph of this essay. So you have two background paragraphs that kind of explain some basic stuff, some background that needs to be set up first before, like, this is how mergers and acquisitions are done right. And the first background paragraph, it kind of talks about the idea of strategy. And then gives an example in the second background paragraph. The first background paragraph, your strategy, your rationale for why you're doing an acquisition, why are you trying to take over another company. It should be related to your own company's core competency, what you're good at and what you want to do. It shouldn't be something unrelated. If I'm a book publisher, I don't want to buy a cosmetics company. That would just be silly. It should be an acquisition that's going to improve your own company and your own core competency and what you're good at and stuff. A general principle of mergers and acquisitions. So then we get into the body paragraphs. Now, and these paragraphs, some of them are really short and underdeveloped, and I think that's not really ideal. But it does make some good points. It kind of basically sets up the idea that Yahoo doesn't seem to have, from the beginning, had a clear strategy about what kind of company is it, what's your core competency, and then in order to guide it through its process of maybe trying to take over other companies or dealing with companies that wanted to take over Yahoo. It kind of talks briefly about this. Maybe I think a lot of older readers would know some of this, but I think maybe more background about the company would be good here. He talks about how it started as a portal, then the company decided to shift to becoming a digital media company and try to go into like broadcasting companies, which really didn't make sense. And then a search company. Okay, that kind of made more sense, but I mean, they were kind of really behind by then. Google had come out, and Google was doing much better at search than Yahoo. Yahoo bought a couple of other little companies that did internet search so that Yahoo could then develop its own search engine. It was kind of too late because Google was already doing a much better job. Then it says Yahoo tried to take over Alibaba, the Chinese online retailer. Why? That makes no sense. Really. It might have made investors happy at the time, but in the long run, that was bad strategy. And then Yahoo tried to buy, Microsoft tried to buy Yahoo, as it says here. Microsoft offered $45 billion, and Yahoo thought, oh, we're worth more than that. Well, they had an unrealistic perception of their value. By that time, Yahoo was declining. They were being a little arrogant, thinking they were really worth a lot more than that, when really they weren't. They were in decline. They probably should have accepted Microsoft's offer because Yahoo didn't really have much of a future after that. So Yahoo refused, and that was a big mistake. And the CEO was forced to resign because of that. By this time, the article doesn't mention it, but so I think it would help if the article also said this. On their webpage, the Yahoo webpage, they tried to diversify into a lot of other stuff. So besides their search engine, their webpage, like their main webpage, was just cluttered with all kinds of other stuff, links to all kinds of Yahoo services. It was very cluttered and very messy because there were so many links and services that Yahoo was trying to get you to do. Yahoo Weather, Yahoo News, Yahoo this, Yahoo Shopping, Yahoo whatever. There was just so much stuff, and it was really messy, and it was hard to navigate. I think that's another thing that needs to be mentioned here. Yahoo tried to over-diversify. They tried to go too far and just went crazy with that, and making their website so messy. Well, as you can imagine, the rest of this talks about how Yahoo eventually declined and failed, and the conclusion, it's the merger and acquisition activities. The writer is focusing on the merger and acquisition activities in terms of buying other companies or in refusing an offer from Microsoft, which would have been a good idea for Yahoo. And then other companies kind of took over the field. Along came, besides Google, along came PayPal, Facebook, YouTube, and such, and Yahoo was just left as a very tiny, insignificant company, a company that has wasted its opportunities. And that's the conclusion. So the writer is focused mostly on the merger and acquisition aspect. There is a lot more that's relevant here. The way that Yahoo over-diversified and tried to do too much too, and their website was poorly designed, and they were just too late to the search business. This makes some really good points. Again, it focuses on the merger and acquisition, and it doesn't really talk about other relevant points. In a sense, it's maybe good. You could talk about all of that stuff, and it's going to be a much, much longer essay. It's probably a good thing at the beginning, in the intro paragraph, the writer specifically focused on merger and acquisitions. Maybe the writer could acknowledge other problems. That would be good. There are other problems, but I want to focus on the merger and acquisitions in this article. It does describe the problems well. The problems of its merger and acquisition strategy, which was very short-sighted. I think it's an interesting to read narrative. It's an interesting narrative. It tells the story in an interesting way of how Yahoo grew and then declined and failed in terms of the merger and acquisition policies. It needs more sources. I think there's some data, some facts here that should be cited, should be referenced, and I think more details. I would like to have more detailed explanation about these mergers and acquisitions and their failures. More details about the problems of some of the particular mergers or particular acquisitions. more detailed explanation of the Microsoft Yahoo relationship when Microsoft tried to buy Yahoo. I think more detailed explanation of that would be good. I would like to see a lot more in-depth discussion of this because this seems in some ways a little brief or superficial. It would be good to have more sources, to cite sources, and to cite a lot more details, go into a lot more detailed discussion of the business dealings of Yahoo with these different companies. So all in all, it's a fairly well done piece. It needs more. It's a good narrative. It's a good analysis of just one of the reasons that Yahoo failed. And it's good to focus just on that, just on the merger and acquisition. I think that's good because you could try to focus on all the reasons why a company failed, and that would lead to a really huge long paper, even a short book. I think the writer did well in, maybe the writer should have acknowledged the other problems. Yeah, there are other problems, but I'm focusing on this. But the writer did do well in just focusing on one aspect. But I think that those could have been explained in a lot more detail. So the problem was presented. The problem in this case study is Yahoo's merger and acquisition policy and how it contributed to Yahoo's decline. It's kind of its slow death. The question is actually, I think it's a very clearly defined problem for the analysis, the thesis statement in the first paragraph. How did the merger and acquisition mistakes lead to Yahoo's decline, Yahoo's slow death? I think that part is pretty well done. It's pretty well done. Just needs some more detail. Some paragraphs are really short, need to be developed a lot more. So as you're thinking about a case study maybe for your final paper, think about that. There could be a lot of reasons for why a company succeeded or failed. You might want to focus on one area, one thing. Unless you just want to write a whole book for your final paper, which I don't think you want to do, and I don't think I want to read a whole book. So pick a company. It could be a company, could be any other kind of organization, institution, educational institution, agency, or anything like that. And it could be why they succeeded, why they failed. It could be one particular reason or aspect why they have failed, why they have succeeded. Or it could be a challenge that they are currently facing. Okay, what is the challenge that Intel computer processors faces right now? What's one of the problems that they face? How are they trying to overcome it, or how will they overcome it, or how could they overcome it, or how should they overcome it? Or what problem is this company going to face maybe in the near future as we look at, what are the trends now in the market? So what's one problem that this company will probably face in the near future? So those are some different things you can think about for your final paper. And you're going to pick a particular challenge or a particular question, and you're going to provide the analysis here. And here the analysis in this case was done in terms of, okay, this is how mergers and acquisitions are done well. Strategy, competency. Consider strategy, competency. What does this do for your company? So the writer just picked those ideas as the basis for the analysis. You do mergers and acquisitions because it enhances the competency of your company, and it has some strategic sense, strategy, competency. And then the writer goes through and explains how Yahoo didn't do that. It did things that had nothing to do with its core competency. It did things that showed a lack of strategy. Like, what kind of company do you want to be? Do you want to be a search company? Do you want to be an internet company? Do you want to be a media company? What kind of company do you want to be? You can't do everything. So the writer clearly picked those kinds of criteria. Those are the kinds of the criteria or standards based on which the writer analyzed Yahoo's mistakes and failures in the merger and acquisition area. So this is a good example for you to maybe look at as sort of a model for your final, but again, you need to cite sources and all that. And later, we're going to look at some other case studies in the book, particularly when Microsoft took over a company called Nokia. We'll talk about that later. This is an interesting one. And we will talk more about analysis and how analysis is done. Okay, that's it for now. We have lots more to talk about in the coming lecture videos, so stay tuned and I'll see you later. Goodbye.